So again, I don't have a lot of time, just 10 minutes, and I have I guess I have the fortunate position to talk about a really tight, little, narrow, very specific topic today. So nothing can make an academic's day more than talking about some little narrow topic. So we're going to talk about residual N effects on soybean in terms of iron chlorosis. This came about because right away this fall, as Dave mentioned, there was a lot of activity out in the field doing soil sampling. A lot of folks came back and said that they had very high levels of looked like carryover N. So right away I started getting a lot of questions on impacts on IDC. So I'm going to go through the data. We've got a couple things to consider here. We don't have data on this pure topic about carryover N. We don't have studies where we've looked at a variety of locations, sampled in the fall, gone out the next year and identified levels of IDC. That would be really highly problematic for us. It would take thousands of sites probably to get much information. What I do have is a lot of spring applied N and the effects of IDC. The other thing for you to keep in your mind is, remember how IDC is. It's unpredictable, it moves around. Sometimes we've got field-wide IDC, sometimes it's in certain spots, sometimes it moves around. The data I'm presenting here, I'll try to give you a feel for what the background level of IDC is. But for the most part, these are going to be either a range of environments, so some hot spots and some not hot areas, or in specific locations. So I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly, but this is actually kind of an interesting point on the effect of nitrate on IDC in particular. If you go to the literature, there's at least 3 main areas where extra carryover N has a potential to impact IDC. And I think this is a perfect microcosm, a perfect example of why IDC is so difficult, because there's so many pathways for the soybean to be afflicted by IDC, and there's so many different pathways that we can avoid IDC. It's not one of these single gene, easy deals to deal with in the plant. And from the environmental side, there's a whole bunch of drivers, and they all interact with each other, and they all affect whether we get IDC or not. So you put all this stuff together, and we just can't, it's nothing that we can predict very well, and it makes management more difficult. But real quickly, there's a couple direct effects. One is that as we take up nitrate, there's actually releasing carbonates back into the soil, so we're actually increasing the pH right around that root. So there's a potential to go the wrong direction in terms of pH right at the root. And as Dave mentioned, everything is happening right around the root. The whole soil doesn't really make any difference. What's really important here is what's happening right on the edges of any of those roots or root hairs as they go down through the soil. The other piece of this is up in the plant. High levels of nitrate in the leaves themselves inhibits this conversion of Fe3 to Fe2, which is the form that's usable by these cells. So we then actually not only are we inhibiting uptake of iron, but we're actually not able to use some of the iron that we might have in the leaves. And then importantly, there's these indirect effects by inhibiting nodulation. Now, nodulation has a potential to actually reduce pH around the root. So a healthy, nodulated soybean that's fixing N should actually give us a little bit of an acidification around the root. This is an old picture that I dug out from an old presentation 10 years ago. Excuse me. This is a split root study where somebody went in and actually grew a soybean with 2 different sets of roots in different pots. They split them early on, grew them, one side inoculated, one side not, put them back into this auger that had a pH indicator by color. So what you see there in the yellow, those little dots there, those are actual nodules that are functioning, and there's a little bit of an acidification of the soil, right? This is auger, but it would be simulating soil around that root to identify that it's actually changed the pH right there. So nodulation is important. We inhibit nodulation when we have a lot of carryover N in these systems. So going all the way back, here's a study George Ream put out in 2006. So I'm kind of just working back through some of the data that I could find in some of the old literature. George was interested in this and did some work with Dave at the time, I believe, looking at some of these things. And this is one particular year where he went out and planted in 3 locations. He had N rates 0, 100, 200 pounds per acre, and then with and without oats. Basically, the take home here, though, is that he identified that the oats were taking up N, obviously. The soybeans in those stands with oats had reduced nitrate levels in the leaves, and they were greener. So there's a potential for cover crops to work for us. So then I jumped on with George and did a couple studies with him after this, and I'm not going to discuss those here, but we kind of followed up some of that outside of this pure N-related piece. So at the same time, John Wiersma over in Crookston, he was doing some of the same work, really interested in IDC, really interested in trying to, on the iron side, but the station over in Crookston, they don't get good IDC symptomology. He was able to create it using extra N applied in the springs. So he went, and I think Angie may have shown this during a breakout, but this just shows a figure where we have the top 2 lines are resistant varieties for IDC and moderately resistant, and then the bottom line is a susceptible soybean line for IDC. It's all in metric, but basically we're looking at about 30, 60, 90, 120, 150 pounds of N. And we can see that those susceptible soybeans dropped off from 30 to 20 bushels or something like that, 35 to 25 bushels across that range as we increased the amount of N applied. We've been doing some work, not on N directly, but we've been using a little bit like John Wiersma did. We've been doing some work on iron chlorosis recently. This particular study finished up a couple years ago. I had a student looking at interactions between IDC and SCN. But again, we used iron to kind of flare IDC and make things worse so that we could study SCN interactions. This is an image of the site, drone image. The beauty of these drone images is you can slice and dice these things back apart. So my student just unrandomized this. So these are the treatments at this particular location. On the right, you can see IDC susceptible lines. On the left, IDC resistant lines. You can see that there's a difference in the yields there. We also added about 67 pounds of N pre-season to these to kind of poke up the IDC, and we reduced yields on both of these. There's a control that has nothing, and then we put in a pretty high level of soy green to try to push these things the other way. So we could kind of create this spectrum of IDC with extra N on one side or extra iron chelate on the other side, and you can see the yields. If we look at over all the locations, so we had about 9 site years of data went into this. These were sites that turned out to be chlorotic, some of them not very chlorotic, and we had this type of a range. So similar to what John Wiersma saw, the susceptible lines are definitely, you take a bigger hit when you add N, but we can also move the other direction with soy green. So I just wanted to wrap up with a little bit of data that we've got recently. I've got another student looking at a project that's even more applied. It's basically looking at rates of soy green, populations, varietal tolerance on the landscape, and trying to look at this from an economic standpoint and figure out where our money is best spent in terms of managing IDC. But we're using the same system here where we're adding extra N. But this one also has with and without soy green. So we've got the top line represents 0 iron chelate added. So with this is just a means of the yields from this year across 6 environments. 44 bushels with N compared to 52. So we lost about 8 bushels on average with that extra N in the spring. But the key here is that we can basically overcome this by adding 2 or 4 pounds of soy green. So that soy green will really push us over the edge. So here's my summary. And it's pretty simple. And this is a reaction to a lot of farmers talking about making big changes in their operations because of this concern about extra N around in the soil. My feeling is that we can still mitigate the risk if you're concerned about extra soil N by choosing better IDC varieties. I know everybody's doing a good job, but try to do better. I don't know what that means to everybody individually. It probably means not just taking the seed guy's advice and saying this brand new line is really great on IDC. Maybe use one that's actually worked for you. Maybe it's going to a higher level of IDC resistance or tolerance that may not have the same yield potential. Apply a good iron chelate. You could also try increasing populations, especially in rows. And you know, we're not in this position anymore, but a good fall cover crop like a winter rye, I think has an opportunity here for us in coming years. So it certainly wouldn't do a lot for us this year. And when we have the panel up, I think Dave could probably address some of the cover crop issues. So again, I don't see a real good reason to do any big changes in terms of rotations. Unless, of course, a farmer's already exhausted all these things. They've got hot spots, you've got hot spots in your field where you have IDC every year. Your beans are basically burning up in an area. If you're concerned that there's going to be extra problem this year, then that's a good place to maybe work around it with a different rotation or do something different within that area or that field. So with that, I am done, and so I could maybe take a question while the other guys come forward. Otherwise, we've got a panel, and we're going to discuss this and carry over N more broadly if you all have questions. See, it's a mistake not having coffee in the afternoon for these guys, I think.
Seth, if you apply all those mitigating factors and your soluble salt levels are high, how high would they have to be before you basically just walk away from the situation saying, I guess beans don't really have a future here, using all this practice?
Yeah, and I wouldn't give you a number because of all the other confounding factors. My suggestion is just based on historical yields, right? What have you seen in those areas, and what have your yields been? I think it's really great to farm these, quarter and half sections in blocks, but there may be times where we have to farm, the eastern or western half of some of these fields differently if they have higher salts. We may have to slice and dice some things a little bit differently. It's not what we want to do, but we may just have to be creative about it. Anyway, I didn't answer your question, but I do think it's not based on historical numbers and yield maps, and look at the economics, and if you can't produce anything better than a 20 bushel yield out there in soybeans year in, year out, you gotta just do something different.